Welcome to the Flower Lounge, a place for conversations with wildly creative people and a little plant-loving wisdom to help you experience life in full bloom. I'm Katie Hess, flower alchemist and founder of LOTUSWEI, and I believe in a world where we're all living at our personal edge. Welcome to this week's episode of the Flowerlounge Podcast. I know you guys are going to love this episode. I am here with Rosalee de la Forêt, and she's an herbalist and a best-selling author of Alchemy of Herbs, transforming everyday ingredients into foods and remedies that heal. It is an awesome book, by the way, and she is passionate about helping people discover the world of herbalism and natural health. As the education director for LearningHerbs, she regularly teaches people how to simplify and effectively explore the world of herbalism. Thank you so much, Rosalee, for being with us.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Katie.
Yeah, so we always start out every episode with an exercise where you close your eyes and go back to a time in your childhood when you played around flowers or plants or trees. And just think about what you were doing at the time and who you were with, and if you can identify a favorite flower or botanical. And then if you were going to describe its personality in 3 words, just reflect about which 3 words you would use. And whenever you're ready, you can open your eyes and just tell us a little bit about what you were thinking and what your favorite was and the 3 words you would use to describe its personality.
Well, I don't have a lot of childhood memories, but one memory just jumped up at me. I grew up in the Southwest deserts, and I remember going on a hike with my dad, and it was some kind of ranger-led hike in Snow Canyon, which was near where we live. So we were on this hike, and I don't remember a lot about it, but the person leading the hike is telling us about things. And I remember coming upon a plant and him pointing at the plant. He said, "This is Mormon tea, and it can be made into a tea." And he encouraged us to break off part of the stem and we could taste it. And I remember that just kind of blowing my mind. I was like, I just couldn't even it was just such a wow, you could eat plants that just grow out here, which, I remember that being pretty awe-inspiring. Now I look back and I'm like, oh, it's kind of sad that I was 10 and just getting that idea. But at the same time, we got to get it at some point, right?
Where were you? What state were you in?
I was Southwest Utah. That's where I grew up.
Oh, wow. Cool.
Yeah. So that's definitely a plant memory I have of just being kind of awe-inspired. And Mormon, I don't grow or live in the Southwest desert anymore. So it's not a plant that I've been around a lot. I did visit it a couple of years ago, and I remember excitedly seeing it. But in terms of, you asked about adjectives to describe it?
Yeah, if it had a personality.
Yeah. Well, it's such a simple plant. It doesn't have leaves. So it's very simple. Just the experience I had with it was very transformational for me because it really transformed how I was looking at the landscape. And I also really remember the taste of it. We had us put it in our mouths. And I remember at the time I wouldn't have had this language, but I still distinctly remember that astringency and kind of slightly bitterness of the plant. So yeah, I just remember the taste a lot too, which is, again, I don't have a lot of childhood memories. So that one really sticks out for me.
And since you know the sort of language of plants now, if you were to describe the taste of the astringency and the bitter, what sort of character would that have if it were a character?
A character.
Plant personality character.
Yeah. I don't seem kind of solid. That's kind of my
solid.
It's here.
That's awesome. I saw this plant. I saw the Mormon tea actually a few months ago when I was in a hike in northern Arizona. It's so twiggy, and I remember just gathering a bunch and putting it in my pockets to make tea. But I ended up never making the tea. It's still in my pocket. I need to pull it out and make the tea.
Yeah, it makes a lovely tasting tea, better than even just chewing on the twig.
And it gives you energy, right?
Yeah.
Isn't it the source of natural ephedra?
It's related to the Chinese medicinal ephedra, but it has less of those potent qualities, but can still be enjoyed.
What we find is typically the 3 words you would use to describe your childhood favorite would describe the way that you bring your gifts into the world. So simple, transformational, and solid. Does it resonate?
It does resonate. Yeah. Yeah. At least maybe what I hope to be transmuting into the world.
Absolutely. So I was looking at your book. I absolutely love it. It's so beautiful. The photography is gorgeous. And it's just such a beautiful format with each herb and what it's for and the yummy recipes. Yum, yum. Yeah. So I wondered if we could, because you're like one of those people that's like a bridge between, this 5,000-year-old, super complex, beautiful system of herbal healing and just sort of like the everyday modern. We're busy. We have a million things to do. And how do we bridge those worlds? And I see you and your book as being such a great bridge. And I wondered if we could just start out by talking about what you call the one solution syndrome and how that doesn't really work for us today.
Yeah. Yeah. So the idea behind the one solution syndrome is kind of looking at how Western medicine might approach illness, especially chronic illness. And so what Western medicine likes to do is you come to a practitioner with a problem, you describe the problem, they make a formal diagnosis by fitting you into this defined illness. And so just like for me, for example, when I was really sick when I was younger, I had an autoimmune disease. It was called Still's disease. And doctors told me, it took them a while to diagnose it. And then they told me, you have Still's disease. And they said, this disease is incurable and it's terminal. And that was that. And then that was like the end of the actually, they gave me steroids, but that was pretty much the end of the conversation.
How old were you?
I was 23 at the time.
Wow.
Yeah.
Whoa. What a bomb to drop at that age. Really.
Yeah. And it was I was actually already studying plants, but I hadn't fully been enveloped into the rabbit hole yet. And I was still, I had a serious disease and I was expecting Western medicine, the pinnacle of everything, to solve that problem. And for them to just say, here's like, they gave me steroids and they gave me a brochure. And I said, good luck. And it was very, like, to be honest, like for 2 days, I was terrified. And then after 2 days, I just snapped out of it. And I was like, no, like, this is not my path. And I started looking. I was just graduated from college. I had, no money and lived in Seattle at the time. And I started to go to all these student clinics, like acupuncture clinics and naturopathic clinics. And because they were, I could afford them. And so I started going. And the thing that really surprised me is I would go and I would be like, okay, well, I have this autoimmune disease. And they were like, yeah. Yeah. And they wanted to know who I was, who are you? What is your life? And, everything from just my mental attitude to my diet, to my activity level, to just everything about me they wanted to know. And they didn't care about like the one disease and then the one solution for it.
Right.
They were looking at all of these things, and my protocols from working with all these practitioners varied. It wasn't just like, okay, you have this disease, I'm going to give you this one solution, but instead it was, here's who you are as this complex being, and here's how we can use a whole variety of things to help support your overall health. And so that was a big transformational moment for me, because it was like, wow, there's so much here. Herbs are not antiquated. Naturopaths aren't just weirdos. There's just everything. I just thought, wow, there's just so much richness here. And so, so the one solution syndrome is just this idea that we have this one problem, and then there's this one thing that's going to suddenly make the difference. And in my experience, especially natural health, it's often like the 20 things we do, right, that all add up together.
Right. It's so complex. And I love how you describe in your book you paint such a beautiful picture of, the 5,000-year-old herbal medicine field, and then how, we actually were using in the US herbal medicines up into the early 1900s. And like when you think about it, pharmaceutical medicine is really only about 100 years old compared to this, like, ancient 5,000-year-old system. Do you want to talk more about that?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really fascinating thing. The history of, sometimes we call it the history of herbalism, but really it's the history of medicine, right? And how we've been using plants as medicine since forever. Just last year, archaeologists unearthed the Homo erectus skeleton, and they researched or like looked at the dental tartar. So this skeleton was 800,000 years old.
Wow.
And so like we started using fire well about 400,000 years ago. So this is very old. And they looked at the dental tartar and they saw that they had been eating things like chamomile and willow, like things that don't have a lot of nutritional value, but are certainly, are medicinal plants. So we've been using plants for so long, even before we were human, right? That was Homo erectus. And up until, really about the 1930s was in this, in the United States where things were really cut off. There's still people practicing with using plants all over, but in terms of mainstream culture, that was cut off for us. And then this new thing has emerged, and it is interesting just culturally, our views about Western medicine and herbalism. And there's just no black and white. Obviously, Western medicine does amazing things that are so astounding, and herbalism does amazing things. There's so much that both there and those perspectives and how we practice that can be taken from that. So
I always think it's kind of interesting though, that like if you dig into the roots a little bit of the pharmaceutical medicine, that there's things like bloodletting and leeches and drinking mercury, like kind of strange practices, right? That we evolved out of into the pills.
Yeah. It is interesting. And it's certainly like, we didn't get everything right. Just because it's old doesn't mean it was right, but just because it's new doesn't mean that it's the best either. So there's both of those. But yeah, herbalism was actually systemically shut down by the American Medical Association. And there used to be eclectic colleges and physicians practicing using mainly botanical medicines, and it was thriving. And then the American Medical Association funded, had big funding behind it. And they came and said, no, we're going to decide what is medicine, and we're going to prohibit people from practicing unless they follow our rules. And so all of these thriving colleges were systemically shut down.
And that was sort of not the end of herbalism, but the sort of the quieting down of the more mainstream understanding of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially here. And obviously herbalism practiced all over the world, but here in the United States, that's where we kind of lost our continuing story. And it wasn't really picked up again until the 1960s and 70s.
Right, because I was just talking to KP Khalsa, who's one of your mentors, right?
He is one of my mentors, yes.
And, he was just describing this whole beautiful system of like grandmother medicine, and how the grandmothers could pretty much handle about 90% of the ailments, and how it was just like really built into the culture. And, I think it's so easy living in the US to develop this American perspective. But when you go to other places and you see that actually, like homeopathic medicine even is, used by many, 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 many people as like the primary care, and herbalism as the primary medical care. And actually, pharmaceuticals aren't even up there in the number one priority, which I find so interesting compared to the US.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's one thing that we've lost is those like, here's the 10 things you can do that are natural and supportive and nutritive before we take additional steps further down the line. And honestly, some people need those further steps. It's not that those are bad steps, but just think about like digestion, for example. Like there's so many things we can do to support healthy digestion. But honestly, Western medicine, they don't have a lot of great ideas for healthy digestion. A lot of that is like shutting off the body's hydrochloric acid, which we need to digest our foods. And like, that's a very common strategy of Western medicine. And I would say, let's try 10 other things before we go down those routes of suppressive medicine.
Right. And that's what I love about your work in your book, is that you help us incorporate herbs and spices that are safe and simple and easy and really, really, really effective too. Do you want to talk about like the benefits of herbs and spices in terms of digestion and antioxidants and immune system, or maybe talk about a few of your favorites?
Sure. Well, what that makes me think of is just, when KP talks about grandmother medicine, I've heard him talk about that many times, being a devout student of his. And I love that idea. And part of what comes with that too is the everyday use of herbs, and not just when we're ill.
Right.
And herbs and spices are full of phytonutrients, not just like most of us are used to hearing about like macronutrients and vitamins and minerals, but phytonutrients are specific to plants and they are so complex. And our herbs and spices contain hundreds of different phytonutrients. And so when we use them every day in our life, we're getting all of these, complex input into our system. And not just when we consume them, but even just being around the plants, like forest bathing that's coming out of Japan. We're just walking through the trees is stimulating our immune system, or smelling the plants, or just gazing lovingly at a flower. That's all affecting us on some level. And then those phytonutrients that we consume are also creating these kind of complex metabolic pathways. Like sometimes I think of it as like, if you're walking, like let's say you have a favorite trail through the woods and you're walking that trail every day, and you're just like wearing that same path on and on. That's kind of the same thing. Like if we eat potatoes every day, we're like wearing that same path over and over again. But even if we eat potatoes every day, but like one day those potatoes are filled with rosemary and thyme and oregano, or maybe another day it's filled with cumin and turmeric and garlic, then we're making a more complex input system in some ways. So, and we're taking in all these different varieties of phytonutrients. And, our ancestors ate so many more plants than we did. And it can be hard to get a variety of plants, especially where I live. I live in the rural area in northern United States, and in the wintertime, we kind of have like our steady root vegetable diet. Those are the things we're storing over the winter and eating. But when we're adding herbs and spices into those, already healthy vegetables and nutrient dense vegetables, and we're getting so much more, from the food. And so ways that's helping, like pretty much every culinary herb can be used for digestion. And so in some ways, when we look at diets that are like the standard American diet, that's often devoid of a lot of spices and herbs, we could ask ourselves, like, does somebody on a SAD diet have digestive problems, or do they have a plant deficiency situation where they're not getting, the herbs and spices that are naturally paired with herbs?
I love that. Say that again. Ask that question again. That's such a great question.
It's looking at our lives as, do we have this like a digestive problem, for example, or do we have a plant deficiency problem?
Love that.
And by regularly incorporating herbs and spices into our lives, we could just be naturally supporting our bodies with something that's missing. So, and that's so true of so many things. I think a vitamin D deficiency is like essentially a sunlight deficiency, right? These ideas that, we're just missing these things in our lives. So digestion, again, pretty much every culinary herb, like if an herb's, we use it in cooking and it smells strongly, that's pretty much a digestive herb right there. And they all have their little nuances of how they can support us in different ways. And we can take larger amounts of them to have a more focused effect on some issue that we're having in the moment, but taken every day and, in all of our foods, every meal, all of our beverages, and we're just naturally supporting our body.
Okay. So starting with digestion first, if anybody has like bloating or gas or inflammation or tummy aches or anything, you're saying add more spices to your food.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you can get, so that could be like the most simplest answer. And then you could get more nuanced into it. So we have Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, Western herbalism, and then like thousands of others of types of herbalism being practiced all over the world. And most traditional forms of herbalism are using what we call herbal energetics. And that's looking at the 4 qualities of hot, cold, damp, and dry. And so the, Chinese medicine, Ayurveda, and Western herbalism, they have very complex ways of going about ascertaining if someone has coldness, dampness, dryness, or cold, dry, damp, warm. So looking at those things, what I do in my teachings in the book is I just break those down to very simple things that you and I experience every day. So a common example is in the heat of the day, it's high summer, you're out working in the garden or taking a walk, and you feel the effects of the sun beating down on you. You feel hot, like you feel hot to the touch. Maybe your throat feels parched. In that moment, are you thinking like, oh, what I really want right now is a steaming hot bowl of really rich, hearty soup? Or are you thinking like, wow, I could really go for some lemonade right now, or some watermelon? So that's basically what energetics is. It's just recognizing that when we have these imbalances of hot and cold or damp and dry, that we're taking external things in to help balance us out. And so so when it comes to digestion, we can say like, yes, herbs and spices are great in general for digestion. Then we could also look at like, signs of cold digestion versus warm digestion. And sometimes that is as simple as most people know if they tend to be hot and they have feelings of warmth, and if their partner like refers to them as the heater and they sleep with one sheet at night, or they tend to be cold and they always have socks on and cold hands and feet. Like sometimes it's just as simple as that. And in that case, using, if let's say someone feels cold a lot of the time, they can use warming digestive herbs like garlic. And what I mean by warming, if you popped a whole clove of garlic into your mouth, which I don't necessarily recommend, but if you did that, you would feel that spiciness, right? Or if you put a chili in your mouth or chewed up some ginger, it feels warming and spicy, not only in your mouth, but when you swallow it, it'll warm up your belly. You'll feel that warmth radiate out into your whole body. So it can be as simple as that, as choosing those warming herbs to match the cool tendencies or vice versa.
That brings up a good point, because I love how you describe in the book about matching herbs, not necessarily to an ailment. So like we were talking about digestion, but matching the herbs to you and your constitution, but also just might be how you feel today during this season, right?
Yeah. Well, constitutional theory, which is looking at your inherent, varieties of cold and hot and damp and dry, that's said that it never changes. But that being said, nature is always shifting and we are nature. So as you said, with the seasons, even the time of day, so many things affect us both internally and externally about how we're doing. So it is about paying attention, being present with oneself, recognizing simple things. Oh, my hands are cold. I could have some ginger tea and warm things up, and just being in touch with that, how we're feeling throughout.
And what are some of the questions? What are some of the questions that you ask? What are some of the questions we can ask ourselves to be in tune with either our inherent constitution or whatever is happening today? What are some of those questions you ask people to figure out the hot, cold, dry, damp?
Yeah, so we kind of talked a little bit about hot and cold. Those are simple as like, do you tend to overall feel warmer or colder than somebody? Let's just take them with heat symptoms. With heat, the colors associated with heat are things like red and orange. So for example, we might see signs of that, like a flushed red face or someone's tongue might be bright red. People, because, if they're feeling warm, they tend to prefer cold weather. People who are warm tend to have a larger appetite. They might tend to be more active just naturally. So those are some things that are the heat signs. And coolness, feeling cooler. The colors associated with coolness are more paleness and blue. So whereas someone with lots of heat might have a bright red tongue, someone who tends to be colder might have a pale tongue. They might have lower energy levels. Of course, if they're feeling cold, they prefer to be by the fire or be in the warmth. And they might have a smaller appetite. One thing when looking at energetics, it's never that one thing, right? It's kind of like this collection of things. So sometimes people are like, well, I have a bright red tongue and I feel warm, but I have a small appetite. That's okay. Like, it doesn't have to be, it's not like ever 100%. We are complex, dynamic beings. And it's more important to just pay attention, to how you feel, and then paying attention to, oh, I feel cold and I had this warming soup and now I feel better and I have more energy, for example. So that's hot and cold. And then there's damp and dry, which is a little bit different, but I'm sure things that people have recognized, like someone who tends to feel more damp, they might sweat more easily or just have like their skin just feels like naturally more moist. And it doesn't have to be like dripping wet or anything, but just more moist. There's hair, maybe they notice they have more oily hair. They might have stuffy or runny nose, which are signs of dampness. And we talked about tongues. So tongues, they can have different colors, but they can also have different coatings. So someone who has a damp constitution tends to have a thicker coat on their tongue. And then their weather preference can be particular too. So people who tend to be damp may not like to be in a really humid environment because they already have enough dampness going on for themselves. In terms of dryness, so someone who has lots of dryness, they might feel like they have to put on lots of lotion to hold their moisture in, and they find life without lotion is not very fun. Or they might find that they have itchy skin or itchy scalp, can be a sign of dryness. They might notice just their mouth and throat are dry. Maybe their eyes just tend to be drier. So those are some signs of dryness.
And so then if you can identify those in yourself, either constitutionally or just how you're feeling today, how do you then match that up with herbs?
Mm-hmm.
Besides getting your book, which everyone should do.
Right. Yeah, so that becomes, that awareness exercise. We kind of mentioned, when you're feeling cold, then we're often craving warm beverages or warm soups. For dryness, for example, if you're feeling like that parchedness that can come along with dryness, dry throat, dry skin. I live in a very hot, arid environment in the summertime, so that's often something that I experience, that dryness, and that could be taking moistening food. So the watermelon is going to feel yummy. Or in herbalism, we have demulcent herbs, which are kind of thick mucilaginous herbs. I think of things like people might be familiar with okra. Okra is definitely a demulcent herb, all that the kind of slime that goes along with it, or oatmeal can have that demulcent quality. So we can have beverages that are filled with things like, say, marshmallow root, which is very demulcent, or one of my favorites is just the common garden mallow, just a weed that's wonderfully demulcent and really high in antioxidants that you can just make a tea out of, and it's sweet and delicious, and it can help soothe that parched feeling and add moisture back to the body. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of that, one, the awareness of how you feel. And then I love how it's just so simple of just like, I feel dry. I will then, use the gifts of plants to restore and help my body restore moisture. And it's just very simple. There's no, in that simple aspect of it, there's no like diseases or, weird concepts. It's just like, oh, this is hot, I'm going to put something cooling on it. This is dry, I'm going to put something moistening on it, for example.
Mm-hmm. And how does that relate to the 5 tastes of herbs?
In both Chinese medicine and in Ayurveda, they put a lot of emphasis on the taste of herbs as a way of understanding the herb's energetic. So we've been talking about how people have energetic qualities of hot and cold and damp and dry. Well, plants have those same qualities. So I've been talking a little bit about that. So, garlic has that hot taste to it, for example. Well, the 5 tastes in herbal medicine are pungent, salty, sour, bitter, and sweet. And each of those tastes they definitely have a complexity and a dynamic qualities to them, but they do tend to fall under these categories. So pungent herbs tend to be warming and drying, for example. And a lot of our culinary herbs are warming and drying. And they can be all over the map, right? Like a cayenne pepper that you pop into your mouth, going to be really hot, right? Probably maybe even uncomfortably hot if you pop in the whole pepper. Versus rosemary. Rosemary is also warming, but just not to the same degree as cayenne, but still has those warming, stimulating properties. So whenever we're looking at pungent herbs, they often tend to be aromatic and antimicrobial, but they fall under this broad umbrella of warming and drying. And so that can be a way of knowing how those herbs fall into those categories. Can be just a simplistic and kind of easy to look at way of thinking how to match them to how someone's feeling. So if someone tends to be, feelings of coldness, then they might be adding more pungent herbs into their life because those pungent herbs have that warming qualities to them.
What about salty?
Salty. And salty is, with salty, obviously most of us think of table salt, right? And that taste of salt. And when it comes to herbs that are salty don't necessarily taste like salt. They could, like seaweed is a salty herb and it tastes salty, but most of these have more of a nutritive taste to them. So we could describe kale as a salty taste. Not that it tastes like salt, but it has that kind of mineral taste to it because it's so nutrient dense. Often our salty herbs are nourishing herbs. They're herbs that we take for often long term as a way of restoring nutrition or just, getting our daily nutrition. So examples are things like stinging nettles and oats and red clover, all salty herbs. They're often moistening in nature, but not always. And they often affect the lymphatic system too. So they can often have some effect on moving lymph or just restoring health to the lymphatic system.
Interesting. And how would you put the salty herbs into the energetics or the hot, cold, dry, damp?
Yeah, so salty is kind of interesting. They tend to be more all over the map. There are many moistening herbs within the salty taste. some drying, and they tend to be more neutral in nature. So in terms of the cold and the hot. And so they're just kind of like, if we imagine a scale and we have hot at one end and cold at the other and neutral in the middle, they tend to just be like one bump in either direction of neutral. So they don't often have really strong energetics in that way. And because of that, we often eat large or take large quantities of these. So like stinging nettle is a vegetable that we can, eat a side serving on, versus cayenne, which has super hot energetics. Like we don't eat a side serving of cayenne, right? We take a small sprinkle of it. But that's those energetics. When things are not too far from neutral, we know that we can generally take a lot more of that. And it's generally how they're used too.
That. Anytime I'm teaching classes about flowers or flower essences, I always talk about the dandelion and how funny, kind of humorous it is that Americans are trying so hard to like get them out of their lawns when they're just like one of the tastes that we most need in our diet in terms of bitter, right? And I'm so grateful that you put two of my favorite things in the bitter category. Guess what those are? Besides dandelion.
Oh man, I was like, that has to be dandelion. I'm gonna guess maybe that might be cacao.
Yes, that's one.
And there's so many lovely bitters. If we're going for another stimulant, there's coffee.
That's it.
That's it. All right. You're a coffee cacao lover, myself included.
Yeah, and I think that's brilliant that they're in the bitter category, because wouldn't you say that's the taste we get the least of?
Yeah, as humans, and specifically our culture, we've systemically bred bitter tastes out of plants. And when I say in our culture, and even like North American culture, we don't even, and we especially don't seek out a bitter taste, right? Most of us, it's like sometimes we say the bitter is the taste we love to hate the most, versus like, say my husband, he's French, and so we'd go to France and visit his family, and bitters are a big part of the traditional diet. And it is something that people seek out and want to have in their diet. And you never see somebody here saying like, oh, I have a bitter deficiency, I need to get more bitters in my diet. No, we're like past the iceberg lettuce. So
yeah, actually in Asia, I don't know if have you tried bitter gourd?
Yes.
It's so good. It's like the first time I ate it, I was like, oh God, I can't stand this. And then the second time was like, well, I can get used to this. And now I just like crave it. It's so good. It's bitter, but it's yummy.
Yeah. And I just like, the bitter taste is so stimulating. It wakes up things. Like when you put something bitter in your mouth, like even just talking about it makes me start to salivate more. And so it stimulates, your saliva, which helps to break down carbohydrates. So it's a digestive function. And then as the bitter taste goes throughout your whole digestive system, it's like challenging in a way, right? And it's stimulating things, and your body is saying like, oh, it's recognizing we have bitter taste receptors all throughout our digestive tract, not just our tongue, and even in our respiratory tract. They're all over, and they're challenging. So when we take bitter tastes, we have increased hydrochloric acid and increased pancreatic enzymes. It increases our production of bile and our release of bile. And so it's doing all these things that are kind of like, it's like, yeah, wake up. And so there is that sense of like, when we first, do have the bitter taste, it's kind of like, whoa. And there's that shock to it, but it can, like, just exactly as you described, be that like your body starts to be like, yeah, I need this. It's revving up.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I know that, coffee is sort of a mixed bag, because we as Americans tend to drink too much of it.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about, coffee being medicinal when used in moderation, say like 1 cup every morning? How is that medicinal?
Yeah. Well, so we have that bitter taste. So that just that tasting that bitter and challenging our digestive systems is, there's that level. And coffee is obviously stimulating, right? And it can be overdone, as you said, but it can also be like, the history of coffee is really interesting, like European history of it specifically, in that most of the kind of social gathering places tended to be pubs where you drank alcohol beverages, and alcohol beverages was most people consume them, even children. It was oftentimes considered safer than water, right? Because they knew you could get sick from water, but the alcohol had been didn't have that same safety issue. And so then we're looking at a society that like socially gets together to drink. And you can imagine just that what comes from that. When coffee became more and more ubiquitous throughout Europe, we started to have coffee houses, and people got together, and instead of drinking alcohol, they were drinking coffee and engaging in these stimulating conversations. And so coffee houses became known as, you know, these intellectual places of debate and discussion and that stimulation of the mind. And so we know, I mean, if you have a cup of coffee, everyone knows that it's stimulating. And sometimes if people have too much, that's stimulating in a kind of nervous anxiety way. But there is a sharpening of the brain that comes along with coffee. And we've studied this extensively in human clinical trials, looking at how coffee can support cognitive health and increase alertness. So there's certainly tremendous medicinal benefits to coffee, and culturally, we love it a lot. In fact, we tend to love stimulants in general, like coffee, tea, and cacao. And like you said, we can overdo it, but just because we tend to overdo it doesn't make it necessarily bad. Just a reckoning of our relationship with it and a balancing there. And well, the other thing about coffee is that it is commonly said that that is the highest source of antioxidants for most Americans. So, yeah, because most Americans aren't eating tons of herbs and spices, and that's where they're getting their antioxidants from, is from the coffee.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah, I don't necessarily know that that's the best thing,
but it's interesting though, right? Because you might be on an eating plan, and maybe the first thing they tell you is to remove coffee. But if you're not supplementing with more herbs, spices, veggies, that might not be the best thing to do.
Yeah. I never ask. I say, if you're sleeping well at night and you don't have any anxiety, and those are kind of the two big ones for coffee. If you don't sleep well at night and you have some feelings of anxiety, and you drink coffee, then it's probably time to cut back a bit and relax a little bit and have a different relationship with coffee. But otherwise, I don't see it as this kind of an inherently unhealthy thing.
And how about cacao? If taken without dairy, what are the medicinal properties of cacao?
Yeah, so cacao is another really rich in antioxidants, and it's kind of interesting that everybody loved chocolate and in our culture, but it was viewed as a junk food, right? For 80s and 90s, it was a junk food. It was an indulgence. And then
it pretty much was, right? Like full of milk and sugar and weird stuff.
It definitely was. Yeah. And then sometime in the 90s, some Harvard researchers went to this island off of Panama to study the Kuna people there, because they were really fascinated that the Kuna people didn't have high levels of heart disease, whereas people in Panama had extremely high levels of heart disease. So they're wondering, why, does this small island have so fewer cases of heart disease? So they go down there and they find the Kuna are drinking like 4 or 5 cups of this very bitter beverage every day. And it's a beverage made from cacao. And so they take the cacao and they go and study it, and they realize that how incredibly dense it is in antioxidants. And that spurred tons of research into its benefits for supporting heart health. Like, many problems associated with the heart are actually due to systemic inflammation. And so regularly consuming things that are high in antioxidants, as well as avoiding things that can cause inflammation, can be a way to address heart health. And it's also been studied for its cognitive function as well. But of course, as you said, it doesn't count if there's like a drop of chocolate or cacao in our chocolate bar. Then it's mostly made up of like dried milk products and tons of sugar. So we have to make sure we're getting like actual cacao in larger doses. And so, eating cacao nibs or getting chocolate bars, but the darker chocolate bars will list how much cacao is in there. And I actually used to say, at least get 70%, but now it's, at least in health food stores, it's very easy to find 85%. And now my favorite is 90%. So the more you can get into it. And sometimes people who are used to eating milk chocolate, that can be kind of a disruptive taste to have the full-on super dark chocolate. But I've had so many people, you just slowly increase your levels of cacao, and it really is an acquired taste. But once you acquire it, there's no going back to the sugary, milk powdery thing that people sometimes refer to as chocolate.
Definitely. I agree. Yeah, no going back at all. Can't do it. Okay, what are we on? Sour. Let's talk about sour.
Sour. Yeah, another stimulating taste that kind of brings us to life. Sour, could certainly mean the sourness, like say, of lemons, but also in herbal medicine can have a more subtle aspect of it too. These herbs, kind of all herbs are high in antioxidants, but the sour herbs are another one that tend to be especially high in antioxidants. And all of our fruits, you might think of fruits as being sweet, but in herbal medicine, they're classified under the sour taste. And so all of our fruits, like blueberries and rose hips and raspberries, strawberries, they all fall under sour. So all of our antioxidant rich fruits. And another aspect of sour, which is interesting, is astringency. And astringency is the act of tightening and toning tissues. And people have probably experienced this if they've had like a green banana or just one that wasn't quite fully ripe yet, or some red wines will give that tannic or astringent taste to them. So it just kind of feels like a drying of the mouth. Mm-hmm. And so earlier we talked about signs of dampness. And so astringency is one way that we can address signs of dampness. And basically it comes in and tightens and tones tissues. So for like an example we can think of is having a sore throat. And when we have a sore throat, it's often because those tissues are swollen or they're lax in nature. And we can have an astringent herb that then comes in and tightens and tones those tissues and helps reduces the swelling in that way and then can bring relief. So one of my favorite sour herbs is, so many. There's elderberry, which I feel like everyone could know about and benefit from elderberry, because elderberry is so antioxidant rich. It's so wonderful. It could just be made into a syrup that could be used in foods or in beverages, but it's really widely known for its ability to either stop a cold or flu from coming on, or its ability to shorten the duration of a cold or flu.
And I've used it a lot during those times if I feel like I'm coming down with something. But more recently, I noticed I'm just craving elderberry, elderberries. And it, here it's like springtime, which means it's starting to get really hot. Do you have any idea why I would crave? Is it just from the antioxidants or?
And the sour taste does quench thirst. So there's that could be going on. It certainly could be the antioxidants. When I first learned elderberries, I learned it as a food, and it's just this really nutrient dense food, not even really as medicine. So sometimes you go like, how much should I take? Just like a teaspoon? I'm like, oh, well, I learned it. We just like poured it all over our crepes, So
like blueberries.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it is really incredible, antioxidant rich. In Maud Grieve, she wrote a book in I think it was first published in the 1930s, and she's from England. And she talked about how sailors would come and say that they were drinking port wine from the docks. And when they drank the port wine, it was helping with their arthritis and taking away their inflammation and pain from the arthritis. And so then she looked into it and found out that the port wine was actually, it was not port wine, which was much more expensive, but it was kind of like adulterated port wine. They were actually selling elderberry wine.
Oh my gosh.
Elderberry wine was helping with that inflammation and signs of heat there. So yeah, it's kind of a cool story.
I love that.
I drink elderberry wine for my health.
I love that. And then I noticed that rose is sour too. I mean, I guess if I think of the fruit, it makes sense. I don't typically think of the petals as sour, but that falls under sour, right?
Yeah. And that's kind of the petals and the bark and the leaves are all astringent. So in Ayurveda, they think of astringent as its own separate taste. And in Chinese medicine, astringency is like a subcategory of sour. So there's quite a few herbs that don't necessarily taste sour, but they have that astringent quality. And so, yeah, like you said, the rose hips can certainly be sour. And then the rest of the plant has that astringency to it. And do roses grow near you? Like wild roses?
Not wild ones.
Not wild ones. Yeah. They grow everywhere here in June. It's just amazing just to see the wild rose bushes everywhere, and they smell so incredible, and the bees love them. And they're my favorite herb to wildcraft. Going out on the fresh spring day, blue skies, sunshine, and hanging out with the bees and listening to them do their work, and plucking petals here and there, and have this wonderfully aromatic medicine. And rose is so beautiful in so many ways. I'm just thinking about it, it just brings a smile on my face. And it has so many physiological properties. Like we could talk about its antioxidants and inflammatory modulating properties. But really, rose brings joy to the heart, and it nurtures and protects our hearts. And there's lots that we can learn from rose in terms of hearts and boundaries. And I love rose medicine on so many levels. I love to just take those roses and infuse them into honey, and that in the middle of winter, and have a fresh biscuit that has rose petal honey drizzled on it. That's good medicine too.
Oh, that sounds so good. Do you ever make lemonade with roses in the summer?
I never have done that, but that sounds really lovely.
Sounds so good.
Yeah. I want to mention for people who might be like, oh yes, rose, I want rose to be in my life. All roses could be used, but even, roses in people's gardens, you just don't want them to be, to have been sprayed obviously with anything. And then you want them to be aromatic. So sometimes hybrid roses have been bred for beauty and not aromatics. But there are many, hybrid roses out there that smell wonderfully too, and those can all be used.
Mm-hmm. So typically the more, or shall I say, if it's aromatic, then it has more phytonutrients or more of the juicy stuff that you want.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. And I really associate that smell with its medicine. And there's probably still so many things we can learn from hybridized roses without smell. But when we're making medicine from it, we really want that particular taste and aromatics to be coming through.
And then the last category, sweet. Let's talk about sweet herbs.
Yeah. So sweet, just as salty, doesn't necessarily taste like salt. Sweet herbs don't necessarily taste like honey. They can be somewhat sweet, but often these are herbs that are deep immunoregulating herbs. There are deep adaptogen or tonic herbs. So we take them regularly, and they're supporting us on this really deep cellular level that might not be experienced right away. Like when you take a bite of a bitter leaf, you have an experience right away. These sweet herbs are something that are very sustaining and deeply nourishing. Not necessarily nutritive like salty, but nourishing on this other level of regulating our hormones, or say ashwagandha, which is helping us develop healthy sleep cycles, which then can be broadly restorative for our overall health. And so those are our sweet herbs. And those are herbs that in other cultures, those are often the prized herbs that everybody knows about and everybody takes all the time. So ginseng, for example, famous ginseng, that's would be considered a sweet herb. Now, if you tasted it, it wouldn't taste sweet, but that's how we classify it. Or, as I mentioned, ashwagandha, which comes from India, and is kind of a similar, deeply restorative adaptogen, similar to ginseng. That's also our sweet herb. So again, this is commonly known, it's not just herbalists who know about these plants, but everybody knows, and everybody knows that, for real strength and endurance and just overall health, that we can be regularly inviting these herbs into our life. And what's interesting about sweet herbs is I often think about people who, from time to time, someone will tell me like, well, I don't want to have to take herbs the rest of my life. Kind of the same way you'd say that about pharmaceuticals, right? Like, I don't want to have to take this pill the rest of my life.
It's kind of like saying I don't want to really eat for the rest of my life.
Exactly. Yeah. We never say that about carrots, So that's what these herbs are like. It's not like they're suppressive in nature. It's more that we have this deep relationship with them, and that when we take them into our body, they're doing these deep restorative works in mysterious ways. We don't always understand how they work.
Yeah, I think that just occurs to me that's one of the big differences in like, Western medicine and herbalism, is that in herbalism, there are herbs that are nourishing, tonifying, nutritive. Their whole job is just to support our bodies in operating at their highest capacity, versus actually quite few, right, that would be classified as like really, their main function is just to go in and like solve a problem. How do you see the world of herbs in terms of like really supporting our highest potential of our body versus fixing something that's wrong?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can certainly use herbs, in that kind of like, you know, wham, bam, here we go, this immediate reaction problem, here's your problem, here's a quick solution for it. So herbs could be used in that way. And sometimes we need them to be in that, in that way, like for a sore throat, like when we have a sore throat, we want something that's antimicrobial and helping support our body fight the infection. And as I mentioned, maybe astringent, tightening and toning the tissues to help relieve the pain. So there can be that kind of is like the difference between maybe like acute care and chronic care, and even just longevity and health and well-being, which, might not be necessarily caused by wanting that, not just due to an illness per se. But yeah, herbs, it's like we have herbs that it's not just what they are, and it's not just who they are and who we are, but what happens when we come together and that dynamic quality. So herbs are coming in, when we take them as a tea or a powder or food, as medicine, they're coming into our bodies, and in our bodies, what's happening is that we're reacting to them. And it's creating this kind of dynamic dance between the two of us and what's going on. And so, for example, some herbs, like, and we're talking about the sweet taste, herbs like astragalus, which is an immunomodulating herb, ashwagandha, many of our medicinal mushrooms, it's theorized that they might be helping to regulate our immune system because they come in and they kind of challenge our immune system in a way that helps it to just act in a, I don't want to say necessarily stronger, but in a more complex way. And so we're getting these inputs from plants, and it's like our immune system is working with those plants, and through that work, it's becoming more dynamic and stronger. So I like to think about that as that it's really the combination of our beings coming together and what comes out of that. And I think in the best situations, in the best world, that's not simply about herbs that we consume, and that's where the relationship ends. Like, I'm going to take this plant and consume it, and then I'm going to get those benefits, and then we're done. But also in a broader reciprocal relationship, whether that's through environmental justice work and ensuring that we have places where plants can grow instead of simply cement, or even the act of gardening, creating gardens in your own yard, or participating in urban gardens, or it's the act of growing plants and interacting with them in that way, or ethical wildcrafting or foraging, which at its highest isn't always about taking a plant or harvesting a plant, but also tending to the plant and its habitat and helping it to multiply and thrive in a variety of ecosystems. So all of that is that dynamic dance between plants and humans. And it's not simply how can I take this and benefit for my personal use, but more of a reciprocal relationship where we're both growing together and having a mutually beneficial experience.
Love that. And can you talk a little bit about the herbal sweet spot?
Yeah. So the herbal sweet spot is this kind of concept I came up with to describe kind of how we figure out what herbs to take. And so the idea being, one, like in the very beginning, we talked about constitution and knowing how we are. Do we tend to be hot or cold, dry or damp? And that's our inherent constitution. As I mentioned, it isn't seen to change. That's what we're born with, and that's how we go through life. But then we also have these external factors that that changes our experience. We talked about that a little bit in the beginning too, like seasons. You might feel drier in the summer, arid summer environment than you do necessarily in the winter. It could be an illness. So you might generally tend to be cold and dry, but then you have this illness with a fever, and so now you're feeling hot. So these external things can change how we're feeling. And so we like to take both of those into consideration and then match that to an herb's energetics. And so an example of that might be like if somebody generally has feelings of coldness and then they get a fever. And so we want to use plants to maybe not necessarily, like we don't use plants to suppress a fever, but we can use plants to help the fever process. And that might mean dilating capillaries and letting some heat escape, or kind of helping to address restlessness or irritability that can sometimes come with a fever. And so often those herbs tend to be cooling. And so the idea being of like, okay, we have a person who generally tends to be cold and now they have a fever, so they're warm. Let's find an herb that is like, we don't want to just like douse them with cold water, right? Like that'd be kind of overwhelming for them, especially since they have this underlying coldness going on. So it's about finding that herbal sweet spot or finding herbs that kind of match up. And there's definitely like a philosophical area of that and thinking about herbs, but really it also just comes down to experience and perceiving how you feel. And herbs are so safe. And if you take an herb that is just too cold for you, like you'll just like your experience will be like, oh, that just makes me feel more cold and I don't really like that. And then try again, and like, oh, this one is the one that really works, or oh, this one's way too warming, I'll try something less warming. So it's just about finding what that is for you and being present so that you can experience that as you go through the rhythms of your day, the rhythms of the season.
And then going back to what you were saying about having a reciprocal relationship with plants, have you had any personal experience or heard any stories about people who, perhaps they're not even consuming it, like you said, perhaps they're just, say, like they have a rose garden or they're growing holy basil and it's, like healing their heart, or, just being a person who works a lot with flowers and flower essences. I'm curious about the bridge then from herbs and plants into energetics and emotions, and what has your training been around just that being, or your experience being around the plants without even taking them in the body? What kind of benefits can we get from them? Or what kind of, maybe another question would be, in terms of reciprocal relationship, what kind of communication can we experience?
It can be such a highly personal thing for people, and I often feel like that's geared to their sensitivity. Like my experience, and this may not always be true, but my experience is people who work with flower essences tend to have that sensitivity and openness to hearing those communications in varying ways. And the stories that I hear from people who have that deep sensitivity can be so powerful and so uplifting. And other people might be more of, I don't know, like people who tend to be more practical. It could just be a practical experience, just like, oh, like this really makes sense. And I think plants have so much to teach us, and not just of like whether they're an astringent or an adaptogen or whatever, there's those labels. I think about I don't know, for whatever reason, I was thinking about mullein. I love mullein. It grows everywhere here, and I always let it, freely seed in my garden, and it's a wonderful lung tonic. And I live where there's lots of wildfires, and they're really wonderful for protecting the lungs. And it does so many things. So I could just go on and on about mullein. But I foremost think of the leaves as being, as this wonderful protector for the lungs, especially in this arid environment and wildfire smoke environment. Well, I recently, just a couple of weeks ago, I was teaching a community class here, and I was talking about herbs, and the next herb I was talking about was mullein. And so I had a screen, with PowerPoint and a picture of mullein. It comes on the screen, and there were groans in the audience, right? People, really? People love to hate mullein.
Oh no!
This is like, it wasn't a group for herbalists, right? It was like, this was like kind of this like broader community class, and like people, it's kind of like how people love to hate dandelion. People also really love to hate mullein, and so there was groans, and I got kind of excited because I'm always really like, I want to bring my love of plants to people, just give a different perspective. And mullein is one that I just love to love. And I think people hate it because they'll see it likes to grow in disturbed areas. And so what happens is humans come along and they disturb an area, right? And they create bare soil and just, unhealthy habitat. And then mullein, where I live, is often one of the first plants to move in, and basically they provide this band-aid for the earth. They shade the earth. It's actually a heavy metal accumulator. So if there's poisons and toxins in the soil, it'll actually pull out that and into the plant itself, but and it brings it out of the soil. And so anyway, I could just go on and on about mullein, but when I think about mullein, I think about the woodpeckers that go up and down its stem, and I think about all the shade it provides and just how it's providing such vital functions in so many ways and supporting so much life around it. And the thing that I get from mullein is like, it does not care about the haters. It doesn't wake up and think like, oh man, people groan when they hear about me and people hate to see me, covering this hillside. Like it just keeps on going, and it just does. It's a brilliant, beautiful thing, no matter what people are thinking about it. And it's so important that mullein keeps going. And I think, I would like to think that as herbalism is becoming more accepted and more people are seeking it out, that I would like people to be like, oh, mullein, we are so lucky to have mullein here. Mullein is so wonderful for our lungs, and it's so beautiful to have it. And I want to be sure and grow it in my garden where I know there's not heavy metals, so that I can, harvest it, and, on and on. So there's those kind of learnings from plants too. Just I think about mullein on days when I get bad reviews. Yeah, mullein doesn't care. It's got to keep on going.
I love that. Well, it's been such a pleasure having a conversation with you. And for the listeners out there, for every herb in Rosalee's book, there are actually several recipes, and I'll just tease you with a few because they just look insanely good. Cardamom chocolate mousse cake, the cinnamon tooth powder, astragalus bone broth, ashwagandha ghee, holy basil ginger julep, yum, turmeric pumpkin seed pate. I mean, her book is just full of recipes. Again, it's called Alchemy of Herbs. Highly, highly recommended. And is there anything else that you want to share with us? Any little bite of wisdom or something that you often find yourself sharing, or advice you are often giving?
Well, one thing you brought up recipes, and one thing that comes to mind is part of the fun of herbalism is not only is it so cool to just learn about all the ways that we can interact with plants and benefit from plants, but there's so much joy that comes along with it too. And oddly, I mean, just because of our culture, I guess, but I would say in the 80s and 90s, and I don't know, there could be a lot of like natural health, a focus on fear, fear of toxins, fear of, so many things. And then natural, and so natural wellness was like a way was kind of approached out of fear of Western medicine, fear of whatever. And I really like to encourage people to embrace the joy of plants and embrace the whole experience. And part of that is through just the natural wonders and joys of being with plants, with our living, and seeing all the beauty and mystery that there is there. But also, as you mentioned, some of those recipes, like however you bring plants into your life, where it's a beautiful bouquet, or, it's burning plants, or it's having delicious foods, or flower essences, or on and on and on, that to really envelop yourself in the joy of, and choose it because of joy and the relationship that can blossom from there.
Love that. And just because I'm curious, what are some of your favorite recipes, or what have you made recently, or something in the book that's like your absolute favorite?
Well, you mentioned the chocolate mousse cake, and sometimes I feel like the reason that we get invited to potlucks here in the community is because people know we're bringing the chocolate mousse cake. So that is one that I love. And I really love herbal waters as we're approaching the warmer months, and just taking fresh aromatic herbs, whether there's a recipe for lemon balm herbal water, but anything like Tulsi is one of my favorite ones, or holy basil, just chop it up fresh and put it in water overnight, and then strain that off and drink it the next day. And that's one of my favorite ways to just interact with the plants and enjoy that lovely taste.
I love that. Ooh, I'm gonna have to try that holy basil water.
And I would say probably I ask people what their favorite recipe is, and the carrot cake is kind of the one that people often talk about for whatever reason, but there's a gluten-free, mostly dairy-free, the frosting has dairy in it, but gluten-free, that really, coconut flour dense cake, but has tons of spices in it, and people really like that.
Yum. Is that featured under nutmeg?
Yes, under nutmeg, yeah.
Yum, that sounds so good. Okay, I'm so hungry now. So I just want to share too that on our podcast page of this episode, we'll have a downloadable ebook that Rosalee has so generously shared with us of her favorite springtime recipes. So I would definitely download that and check that out. Thank you so much for being with us. Really, really, really appreciate your time. It's been wonderful chatting with you and so illuminating.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Katie.
Thank you. And I will just mention too, for anybody who is in the New York area in May, we will be doing a flower flash mob again. And if you're in the Chicago area, if you'd like to fly into Chicago on June 15th, we're having another Flower Lounge event. So inviting all the listeners to come and join us in person at these events. And thank you again for joining us on the Flower Lounge podcast. Thank you so much for listening to the Flower Lounge. I'm Katie Hess, and we'll be releasing a new podcast every Wednesday. If you like what you heard, or you know someone who might be touched by our conversation, share it with them. And don't forget to subscribe. To find out what your favorite flowers mean about you, take the quiz at LOTUSWEI.com.